We're going to welcome those who will be watching this video sometime in the future. November the 27th today, 2022 in Coombs, British Columbia on a beautiful sunny November day. My message this morning is The Quest Begins, and the subtitle is Who is Jesus for You? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian pastor, and he lived in Germany during the rise of the Nazi regime under Hitler. He was an advocate for speaking out against the atrocities of the Hitler regime, and he was a strong proponent for the Jewish people in particular. And he was really, of course, terribly upset by what was going on in the wider society. One of the most famous books that he wrote is called The Cost of Discipleship. It was printed in 1937. So, things were underway in terms of the Nazi regime's presence throughout Germany, as well as the wider war that it was exploding. And that Cost of Discipleship is really kind of a classic for many people. And he was talking about what it means to be a follower of Jesus when there's difficult times, either in the world or in your life. As a staunch opponent to Hitler, he was arrested in April 1943. And when he was in prison, he started a lengthy correspondence with his fiancée, Maria. And so he would write regularly, at least every week, I think it was, letters to her telling about what life was like in the prison and his reflections of what it meant to follow Jesus in the midst of a chaotic world where everything seems to be so dark. Out of the letters after his execution in the concentration camp, Maria, published those letters called Letters from Prison. And in one of those excerpts from a letter, he talks about the challenge of being a follower. And he expressed his belief that in the years ahead, even after he died, one of the great questions for Christians, those people who are looking to follow Jesus, is who's Jesus for us? Herbert O'Driscoll, who used to be the dean at Christ Church Cathedral in Vancouver, picked up on that question out of the book, who's Jesus for us? And he responded by saying, it's not an easy question to really answer. On the surface, it seems maybe straightforward, but when you kind of dig a little bit deeper, you can answer it from a variety of positions. So it could be answered perhaps from this angle. Some drawing on history might say that Jesus was this Jewish rabbi who lived around the first century of the Common Era, and he was crucified by the Roman authorities. Others might say he's the founder of the Christian faith, and his birth kind of started the movement for Christmas celebrations that we have every year. Others might think that Jesus, or consider him to be kind of a tragic hero figure. I mean, this person who had a dynamic kind of following and yet died a cruel death on the cross. So you can answer it from a lot of historical places, depending on where you come from. But the question, who is Jesus for us individually as people who might be followers of Jesus or a community of faith, it probably requires something a little different beyond this historical perspective of who Jesus might be. And as Bonhoeffer implied, for him, Jesus was the one who called him to stand and preach against the violent and repressive Nazi regime of his day. So he took a stand, believing that Jesus was the Prince of Peace and that Jesus wanted people to get together and live in harmony and to support one another. So he spoke out quite vehemently in the pulpit regularly and in the national news beyond Germany against Hitler. That commitment that Bonhoeffer had to Christ gave him strength every day to face the trials that ultimately led to his imprisonment and then the execution in that concentration camp. Now, of course, here we live in Canada, so we're not experiencing all the trauma and the tragedy that they are in other places around the world where there are wars going on and great atrocities like Ukraine or Yemen or other places where there's repressive regimes. We live in relative safety, and so we don't have to have our faith kind of put on the line for what we really believe, like a Bonhoeffer did. Now, Bonhoeffer, of course, reminds us in this Advent season still, though, we have to think about who's Jesus for us. And again, depending on where you come from, you're going to have a different answer, perhaps. And for those of us who are believers, this question, who's Jesus for me or us, is a question that might spark us to consider the kind of commitment we have to Jesus. Is he the babe in the manger, this miracle worker? Is he a bringer of grace from God, the risen Savior that we live for? Is he a mystery to you, or simply one holy person among so many others, who've come up through the centuries and have millions of followers even today? Now, I can't tell you what to believe. I can only reflect on it for myself. And certainly as a community of faith, we share common beliefs, but each one of us, I would say, probably has a little bit different view from an angle of our perspective, who Jesus is for us personally. So in this season ahead, I want you perhaps to explore, do this inner quest of sorts, to explore in new ways, who's Jesus for you today? And in that quest, I hope you'll discover something new that will enrich your life, or give you greater hope, or healing in a season that's been really rough, or to find greater joy and happiness in life today. And starting on a quest is really kind of an apt part of the Christmas story itself. Because in the Advent season leading up to Christmas Day, at least in churches and in some songs that you hear on the radio, there are lots of people in the Christmas story that are on various quests looking for someone or something. The Magi, you'll hear their story later on in the season, following that star that led them to that manger where they believed they would find the Messiah, this Jewish king. We read about Mary and Joseph on a quest of sorts to discern how God would bring them through to be parents of Emmanuel, God with us. I mean, you heard a little of the story from Nancy, how this angel came to Mary, and I don't know what your experience with angels is, but I mean, she was a little bit confused without a doubt, and she was afraid to begin with. She didn't know what it really meant. And even though she accepted this kind of responsibility, she and Joseph still had to struggle with what it meant to be the parents of Emmanuel. Each participant in these holy quests was seeking to discover who Jesus was for them. And even many of the ancient prophets of Israel were on this quest to see God breaking into the present dark. The passages from Isaiah 60 and 9 back in the Old Testament that we read responsibly, this is Isaiah kind of expressing the longing for the people of Israel because they were living in terrible times. They had been overwhelmed by the forces of Babylon, and many of them had been taken away to a home that they never, ever thought they would go to, which was Babylon. And they were removed from Jerusalem. And so in that dark period in their history, they were wondering, God, are you with us? God, where's the Messiah? Where is the light? There's a book by Anthony Adur called All the Light We Cannot See. Maybe some of you have read that. I really enjoyed it. And it's the title that really fascinated me because in some sense, that title, All the Light We Cannot See, speaks to those inner lights that illuminate our lives or sometimes are hidden. Have you ever gone through a period in your life where you thought you knew it all, life was going along so well and everything looked great, and then it was like the light went out, like your life got kind of really messed up because of either personal things that were going on, health scare, kids, any number of things. Your life gets diverted and all that light and joy and hope and happiness kind of gets smothered and the light goes out. And you have to look even closer to find the light that you cannot see visibly. The biblical writers often use images of inner light to describe how God meets them or gives them insight into God's presence and work both within their lives or around in the world. If you think about how you experience God's presence or light arising, maybe a long time ago or more recently, or maybe never, it's probably a mystery to you. How would God speak to us? How would God give us light? How would God let us know what's going on about God's presence around us? You see, in truth, unless God illuminates the path within us, and unless we're really, I think, open to enlightening our minds and hearts, how would we ever actually discern that there's a God at all? it would just still be a mystery, or it would just make no sense to you whatsoever. But once there's some glimmer of illumination, it can grow over time to a bright and a guiding light for our journey here on earth. And that light of God has the power to draw us into a spiritual quest, so to speak, to discover who God truly is for us, or to find our place in the world, or a greater purpose in life than maybe we haven't had before, or how we fit into God's larger story. Are we just, here individually, or is God doing something in a grander scheme of work that we might be able to kind of fit into? When I came to the place as a young man, when I wanted to give my heart and life to Jesus, I really didn't know what I was getting into. Sometimes I would still wonder that, right? Dealing with a group of people like, well, maybe not you people, the Port Alberni folks, right? When I'm in Port Alberni, I'll say that about you. You know that. I expect you in your journey of faith, wherever you find yourself, sometimes when you kind of move in there, you just don't know what you're getting into. You don't know anything really about who God is or who Jesus might be. You may have heard stories growing up in, family homes or traditions, or just because of the culture around us, but that doesn't necessarily make a difference to you personally. So when I kind of, at around 16 years of age, said I wanted to follow Jesus, I was just beginning to see a little bit of that light illuminating my own spiritual path before me. But as I grew older and continued to seek more of God's presence, I found more and more light illuminating my path and shining kind of into the cracks of my life and my mind and my soul, giving me kind of a desire to experience more of God's presence. And my quest for more of God led me to discover how much I really don't know. Have you ever been there before? You think you know something about a certain topic or a subject matter that you feel pretty confident in, and then you find out, oh, there's another surprise around the corner. Or you find out, oh my gosh, I really didn't know as much as I thought I did. But I found on this kind of lifelong quest to discover more and more of who Jesus is for me, that there's this deeper sense of peace and a greater sense of joy and wonder at all of creation and all the people around me. I have so much more hope and love, even though life is never always easy. And even though there are terrible things going on in the world around us and problems at home, I still have a sense of peace and God's calm presence with me. And those have kind of been a foundation for me in my journey of life. And I'm so glad that I've got that foundation, because there's many things that I know lie ahead that are going to shake that foundation. And I think of my quest, and perhaps your quest, to discover who Jesus might be for you isn't unlike that of Mary and Joseph. Think about it. Mary and Joseph, who were two bewildered people when the angel spoke to them. Mary had this kind of angelic vision, this person who stood before her, giving her this very interesting news that she was going to be the mother of God, Emmanuel, God present with us. And Joseph had a dream where an angel spoke to him and said, you better take Mary to be your wife because you're part of the plan too, Joseph. Although they were initially afraid, because who wouldn't be afraid if you had this angelic vision or you were woken by a dream that seemed to call you into a different path, a different way of living? They were both a little bit startled. But they were open to God's message for them. That illumination, that light that started to kind of glimmer inside of their hearts and minds and souls became this flame that enabled them to follow the path that God had for them. And it changed their dreams, it changed their world, but it also changed our world in wonderful ways. Now, I expect that when the baby Jesus was born and they became parents to this holy child, they didn't have the foggiest idea at those early days how Jesus would actually change their lives. And I dare say none of us who are parents actually have the foggiest idea of how much raising kids will change our lives. Mostly it's for good, but every now and then you just wonder, did we make a mistake in having 3 kids or 2 kids or whatever the case may be, right? getting back to Mary and Joseph, they had to struggle with the reality of a changing relationship with Jesus throughout the years that they spent with him. Remember, he went from being a baby, totally dependent on the care of Mary and Joseph, totally dependent, like every other baby is who has ever been born. But as the years went by, he became an inquisitive boy. I'm sure he was just like boys, always getting into mischief. I think Jesus wasn't just a goody two shoes. I think he was getting into some mischief. Probably he had Mary and Joseph to kind of tell him this is the right thing to do. That's the wrong thing to do. We have this, this understanding that somehow Jesus was the perfect little child. I think, God created Jesus to be like any normal child, inquisitive, sometimes making poor decisions, not always being obedient. But through the struggle that Mary and Joseph had as they raised him, Jesus started to gain his own sense of who he was and God's place or God's work in his life. As he grew into his teen years, he was a young carpenter's apprentice with his father, Joseph. And he had this amazing experience of kind of knowing and understanding deep things and truths about God, because it says in the scriptures when he was about 12 years old, he went to Jerusalem, probably for one of the holy feasts, and his parents, Mary and Joseph, lost track of him a couple of days, and they found him on the steps of the temple talking with the rabbis and the chief priests and all of those knowledgeable people. And they said they were amazed that Jesus was so kind of developed in his spiritual life that he could converse with them at these deep things. All the while, as he grew into his own manhood, Mary and Joseph's relationship with him was changing and adapting, just as any parent has to adapt as your kids get older, as they start to come into their own life, the relationship changes. And I hope for most of us it gets deeper and richer. But of course, that's not always the case. We know that. But I think it was for Mary and Joseph. When Jesus was a man at his baptism, he had this unique confirmation from the Holy Spirit as it kind of hovered over him. His cousin, John the Baptist, was baptizing him in the Jordan River. And then these words that God spoke over him, that this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him. And those who witnessed that event proclaimed that indeed he was Emmanuel, God with us. So all the changes that happened in Jesus' life expanded Joseph and Mary's understanding of who he was. It was like the light in their lives was growing as they had a deepening relationship with Jesus, who was not only a son, but also the Messiah. Now, just think also, though, how Jesus' death and resurrection must have totally changed Mary's perception of who Jesus really was. From the baby she had born so long ago in that little town of Bethlehem, to the risen Savior of the world after his crucifixion and resurrection, it must have been mind-blowing. It must have totally flipped her mind in terms of thinking who Jesus was for her. When Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, is asked by Jesus to tell him who he thinks Jesus really is, right? Peter boldly says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." But of course, Peter didn't really understand what he was saying at the time. It would only come years later when he understood the full impact of what God's illuminating light in Peter's life and the revelation of Jesus as he went through not only walking with Jesus, but beyond Jesus' death and resurrection. Peter now, in those later years, had a fuller understanding of who Jesus was for him. Now, we may say similar words as Peter did at various moments in our life. You're the Christ, you're the Messiah, my Lord. But we fully don't know the implication of those words and what it really means for us. We say them in church, we've done creeds, we sing songs from the time, well, for many of us who were little kids. And sometimes you just don't know what you're doing. You're kind of falling in line with someone else. But at a certain point, you kind of have to make that decision on your own, one way or the other. I love how O'Driscoll phrases it. He says, we may discover Jesus in our childhood if we, go to Sunday school or something like this. But the images of Jesus from our childhood will not of themselves carry us through the rest of our lives. The images of Jesus from our childhood will not of themselves carry us through the rest of our lives. By which he means a Sunday school faith is not enough to sustain you through a life filled with all the ups and downs, the turmoil of life, the suffering that we have to go through, the questions, the doubts, the fears, the problems. If you have just a Sunday school of faith, it is not going to be enough to get you through the toughest things that we'll all face in life. Only this ongoing quest to discover the full depths of Jesus for us will keep us resilient throughout life. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about that we have to keep growing in our understanding of who Jesus is for us today, not 40 years ago or 60 years ago when we were in Sunday school, but today, because our lives have changed, the world has changed, and so our relationship with God has to kind of keep up with that, or else we won't have what we need when the crunch really comes. Now, a quest might hint at doubts and setbacks in our faith, which it frequently does. But despite all the detours of life and all the questions we have of faith and what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to believe in a kind of a world beyond, the Christian faith belief, I hope that we're finding our feet on solid ground, believing in what we do. And I hope that quest, with all its detours and setbacks, actually reveals over time more and more of God's light illuminating your life and illuminating the path for you. And I believe that a similar quest has to be undertaken by communities of faith. At different times in our shared life, we find that Jesus is calling us to be different than what we used to be like. Cultures change, neighborhoods change, cities change, pandemics and younger generations change everything. Our churches in the West were once full and bustling. Remember those days? Well, for those of you who went long ago, not so much today. There are lots of churches or lots of places in the world where, like China and Russia, Christians or other people of faith are persecuted, or the faith is subverted by political leaders and their desires for what they want. Any number of challenges are going to be faced by communities of faith. And that's why we have to keep finding Jesus for who he is today for us as a community of faith as well. Not in the 60s, not in the 80s, but today. It will require deeper reflection. We might have to change some things. And I know most people that I've met in churches hate change. I know Heather's saying, or a few others are saying, oh my gosh, Ed, don't talk to me about change. We've gone through so many changes. We just want to be comfortable when we get into our 60s or whatever. Through all the changes around us, God calls us to find his light and to continue the quest to deepen our faith and discover our new role in society or our place in life. Matthew 5, Jesus says, you are a light of the world. City on a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people kind of light a lamp and then cover it over. No, they put it on a shelf so it gives light to everyone. And then he says, let your light shine before people, that they might see your good deeds and praise God in him. Maybe at some point along in their relationship, Mary and Joseph felt like life would sure have been a whole lot simpler if they hadn't been called into this unique relationship with Jesus. I'm sure it would have been. But God invited them on a quest, and that quest was beautiful and tough. But through them, God began something new that continues to have a wonderful impact even on our day and age, 2,000 years later. And I dare say through you in your quest to find God's light, or to find the Spirit, or to experience God in a new way, maybe something will happen in your life in the season before us. And I pray that God will continue to open your mind and your heart to seeing something more beautiful or more hopeful or more peaceful in this season as we move towards Christmas. So let's start this Advent season with an open heart and mind and invite God to do a new work in and through us in the weeks ahead.